Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we try to cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff.
And I'm Jay McKenzie.
Today on the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, we're joined by best-selling author and conspiracy theory expert Mike Rothschild. Mike is the author of The Storm is Upon Us, How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything, the critically acclaimed document of the QAnon conspiracy theory and its adherents. Mike is also the author of the upcoming book, Jewish Space Lasers, The Rothschilds and 200 Years of Conspiracy Theories. We're thrilled to have him with us today. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a rating and a review on the app that you're listening on. Be sure to subscribe at didnothingwrongpod.com to get our content straight into your inbox. All of our work is free, but we're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that ensure that we can keep doing this important work. Thank you. Mike, thanks for coming on. We're glad to have you back.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Glad to have you. This is going to be fun. Your upcoming book is titled Jewish Space Lasers, The Rothschilds and 200 Years of Conspiracy Theories. We're really excited for it.
I'm excited about it too. I've been carrying it around in my head for a while, and I'm excited to get it out there and have people see all of this crazy stuff I've been reading and watching and looking into, and some of the rabbit holes I went down. And there's a lot there. There's a lot there.
Nice.
How did you decide on this? How did you get to this book?
It felt like a real extension of the QAnon book, because the Rothschilds are mentioned a little bit by Q, probably not as much as Soros is, but they're definitely in that world. So it felt like a natural next step for me to really go into kind of where those theories come from. Why is it always this family? And of course, I've got the name connection. And I'm not related to the Rothschilds. And I wanted to kind of understand, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a Rothschild? Why would anybody think that me, some guy writing, blog posts and doing podcasts is connected to this family that has trillions of dollars and controls everything? Why do people think the family has trillions of dollars and controls everything? So it wasn't so much of an exploration of that Rothschild family. It was really more of, why is it always those particular Jews? There's a lot of writing asking, why is it always the Jews? But I really wanted to know, why is it these Jews in particular? What did they do? What didn't they do? And it took me on a lot of very interesting roads, I'll say that.
So what is the origin story? Because you seem to have pinpointed an actual beginning to this. So how did this begin?
Sure. And it's a good question. And it's important to understand that with almost all conspiracy theories, there is a grain of truth to what they are about. They're not usually completely made up, because then they can be dismissed fairly easily. But the ones that have just a little kernel of truth in the middle, you can't just dismiss them, because then their believers go, well, what about blah, blah, blah? Are you saying that doesn't exist? And then you say, well, no, that does exist, but the rest of it isn't real. And then you start needing to actually explain things. So the origin of the theory that the Rothschilds control everything, rule the world, fund both sides of every war, it really started in the decades after the Battle of Waterloo. And the Rothschild family made really the bulk of its fortune, at least its early fortune, in the Napoleonic Wars. So they were the principal suppliers of gold and money to the British and Prussian forces fighting Napoleon. The continent was being blockaded, and the Rothschilds, specifically the family patriarch Mayer and his son Nathan, who had gone to London by then, had come up with a system of moving gold and money back and forth across the channel. So they were able to sell gold. They were able to finance bond issues that were able to fund Wellington's army. And all of this, sort of culminated with the Battle of Waterloo, and Napoleon is defeated and the Napoleonic Wars end. And during the course of the conflict, the Rothschilds made a gigantic amount of money, because the British Empire, the Austro-Hungary, they were spending enormous amounts of money fighting this war. And the Rothschilds were making a lot of money off of the loans and the interest and the gold. So there was a sort of a need to explain how the family got this rich this quickly. And there were all kinds of explanations that they had a talisman that brought them great wealth, that they were connected to all the royal families, which of course they were. But then there was this idea that started that the Rothschilds knew the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo before anybody else. And this idea had started to crop up in the mid 1830s. The Battle of Waterloo was in 1815. So it started to crop up about 20 years later. And then in 1846, there's an anonymous pamphlet in Paris, written by somebody going under the name Satan, who accuses Nathan Rothschild, who had died 10 years earlier, of being at the Battle of Waterloo, watching the carnage, being so close he could smell the smoke, he could see the mangled limbs of the dead, and he gets on a horse and he rides across the country, and he ends up at the Belgian port of Ostend, takes a ship across the English Channel in a once-in-a-century storm, gets to the London Stock Exchange, tells everybody that Britain lost, British stocks crash in value. He buys them all up. The news comes that they won, and the stocks go back up in value, and he is a zillionaire, and now he controls the British Empire. So that story, which has been told over and over and over in everything from Nazi propaganda films, Alex Jones, David Icke, that starts 30 years after the Battle of Waterloo with this pamphlet that sparks this whole pamphlet war in Paris. All these other things happen, but it really starts with that story.
Wow.
That's really interesting.
History. It's
yeah. Well, yeah, I kind of read a little bit of history myself and know enough about this time period that makes me wonder how much this is related to Napoleon III and how much, because the Napoleonic Empire ends with Napoleon I, but eventually Napoleon III comes to power in the 1850s. And so I guess if you look at it from that perspective, it would make sense for his supporters, which he still did have a support base and people who wanted him on the throne, to have a scapegoat, have a convenient villain. And so how much was that intentional or part of their propaganda? Was that a feature?
There was definitely a lot of political upheaval in France at that point in the late 1840s. You had a series of revolutions in Europe in 1848 that are not particularly well known about in the US because they didn't really affect the United States. But there was a real rising tide of socialism, of anti-wealth propaganda, that sort of eat the rich stuff that we still have. Right. And the Rothschilds were by far the most visibly wealthy family in Europe. So a lot of the anger at wealth accumulation, a lot of the anger of Europe's growing middle class was focused on the Rothschilds. And of course, it dovetails perfectly with anti-Semitism. So the other part of the Satan pamphlet, which was written by this kind of professional gossip who wrote a bunch of really other anti-Semitic, I almost said blog posts, a lot of other pamphlets and newsletters and sort of, self-published books. A lot of this also revolved around a train crash. So you had the growing technology of trains in Europe, and these trains were able to connect cities to other cities, parts of the Holy Roman Empire or former Holy Roman Empire states to each other. And of course, they crashed. They would derail in extremely gruesome ways. And the press at the time really reveled in writing these horrifyingly graphic depictions of trains crashing, limbs severed, people drowning, screaming for their mothers, that kind of thing. So a Rothschild-owned train derailed in 1846, just a few months before this pamphlet was written. And I think something like 14 or 15 people died. And it was news for a little while, and then people just moved on. It wasn't even the worst train crash in French history, but it was a train line owned by James de Rothschild, who was Nathan Rothschild's brother. And so the Waterloo legend was really wrapped up with James's perceived complicity in this train crash. And there was a lot of anger over the Rothschilds and their ownership of the rail lines in France. That there was a lot of crossover with the naturalism movement. So people who thought that they were destroying pristine French lands. There were a lot of accusations of fraud and bribery. So all of this stuff gets wrapped up with this Waterloo allegation. So suddenly you have this pamphlet that accuses the Rothschilds of running these sort of multi-headed schemes to profit off of French misery. And this pamphlet is a huge success. It sells something like 60,000 copies. It gets reprinted a bunch of times. It sparks this whole thing of support pamphlets, opposition pamphlets. This goes on for years, and it gets tied into the revolutions of 1848. So there's a lot of anti-wealth, a lot of populist fervor that gets really tied up with anti-Semitism right around this time.
So, like you're saying, you've got nearly 200 years of material in this. What sort of research went into this? Where did you go? Who did you talk to?
So I made the decision early on that I was going to primarily use the books and pamphlets written at the time. And then, going forward, the newsletters and then the videos and then the internet posts. A lot of these people are dead. A lot of the most scabrous anti-Semites of this period have been dead for 150 years. So it didn't make sense to me to try to track down some of the worst people now. I don't really want to talk to Alex Jones. I don't really want to talk to David Icke. Not that they talk to me anyway, but I don't trust them. And I wanted to use the things they've written rather than the things that they're going to say to me. Right. So I was able to really dig in and find a lot of really obscure books, a lot of newsletter archives, a lot of academic papers. A lot of the Rothschild archives have already been gone through for a bunch of other biographies about the family. So I was able to use a lot of public domain work. I really relied on the Internet Archive because they've got this whole voluminous library of really obscure crank stuff from 150 years ago that I'm not going to be able to get at my local public library.
No.
I might have to pay a couple of $100 for some used copy of it. And I don't really want to do that. So I was able to find all of this stuff for free. There's a lot of newsletter archives that are out there for free. I was able to get some tips on various other articles that I was able to find, newspapers.com, Library of Congress, the Congressional Record. So all of this stuff is out there. It's just that nobody had really gone through it to figure out what here matters and what is driving the discourse that we're having to this day.
When you went through all this, did you see a lot of similarities between the more recent QAnon stuff? I'm sure there are a lot of similar themes. Did it feel, because it's a different time period, it's different source material, it's written in books and maybe more long form, did it feel different, or did it feel just a different form of the same thing?
It felt very much like a different form of the same thing. It feels very similar to the accusations that we have now. And what I found is you're really able to trace an almost direct line from the ravings of Alex Jones to the works that inspired him, to the works that inspired those works, to the works that inspired those works. And they keep regurgitating the same theories over and over. So you will see over and over and over again, the Rothschilds in Waterloo, the Rothschilds funding both sides of every war, the Rothschilds controlling the British money supply, the Rothschilds paying for drugs and pornography to dilute the minds of the Gentile masses. The names change, the dollar amounts change, but the accusations of a kind of all-powerful super government run by the Jews, and the Rothschilds are running the Jews who run the super government. That stuff really doesn't change from iteration to iteration. So it actually makes it quite easy to track these theories and kind of find each mutation. And one of the things that I really kind of drew the line for myself early on was I wasn't going to use this book to catalog every single Rothschild theory, every single Rothschild mention. I really wanted to focus on the ones that we're kind of still dealing with now. So if you look at something like the mentions of the Rothschilds in a book like Behold a Pale Horse, that's hugely important. Whereas some of the mentions in maybe some crank newsletter of the 70s, it's maybe not as important. So I'm sure historians will find things to quibble with here, but I'm not a historian, and I'm trying to distill hundreds of years and countless, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of mentions into a digestible sort of pop book. So it's a real challenge, but I also really enjoy doing it.
Did anyone in the Rothschild family actually speak to you, or did you speak to anyone that is associated with them?
I reached out to quite a number of family members. Most of them did not respond. A couple of them said basically something along the lines of, it's a good idea and we're not going to be involved. I did speak a little bit to their family archivist in London, who answered some questions for me and who gave me the names of some more academic figures to talk to, and I was able to interview those people. But by and large, the Rothschilds do not address the rumors and the myths about them. And that was one of the things I actually wanted to explore in the book, is like, what is the Rothschild response to all of this? And the response is to not respond to them. I mean, it's very much similar to the way the royal family works, of just like ignore it, because the people who believe all of this stuff are not going to believe a Rothschild heir going on an interview and saying, well, no, of course we don't control the 90% of the world's wealth. You know, the conspiracy believer is going to say, well, they have to say that. Of course they're going to say that. They're never going to admit their level of control. So they really they let most of this stuff go, because they don't want to put themselves in the position of having to prove a negative, prove that they don't do this stuff and they don't, you know, that's not their history. And they can't really do that. So they really kind of let other people do that for them. And I hope that this book goes at least some of the way to dispelling some of the myths about the Rothschilds that maybe you don't believe, but at least you've heard, and no one's ever really said anything why it's not true. So this is kind of a book about the Rothschild conspiracy industry. It's less about the Rothschilds, and it doesn't have any involvement from the Rothschilds.
I think it's true for me, and it's probably true for a lot of people, that I knew about all these Rothschild conspiracy theories before I knew about QAnon, and it was something in my head, but I couldn't tell you where I first heard it or in what context. It's just sort of out in the world. And yeah, so you've done a public service by synthesizing some of this so we can make sense of it in a controlled and and helpful way. But
and those are ultimately the people who I think can be reached. It is like you said, the people who have heard all of this stuff, and they don't necessarily believe it, but they don't know where they heard it, and they don't know why it's not true. So I think there is a lot of ground to cover with that large majority of people. It's not the hardcore conspiracy believers. It's the people who just heard something about it one time and would like to know more. It's just no one's ever presented it to them.
Makes sense.
Indeed. So what do you think some of the common characteristics are that are shared by these various conspiracy theory movements that we're seeing?
Yeah, I would say that the thing that they have more in common than anything is an almost need to believe that there is this all-powerful group of globalist controllers. And of course, that didn't start with, you know, Trump's allegations of the deep state or anything like that. You go back and you call that the New World Order, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Illuminati. There's a countless other names for it. And of course, I found even more names for it digging back into history more. There's the Committee of 300. There's the Hidden Hand, the Society of the Elect, the Club of the Isles. There's always going to be a group of people who are secretive and conspiring against you. And of course, that group of powerful people has to be funded. And the funders of that group are almost always wealthy Jews. And the Rothschilds are seen as the wealthiest of the wealthy Jews. So the thing that they have in common more than anything else is this belief that the Rothschilds are funding all of these things and using all of these front groups and companies and sort of shadowy organizations to do all of this. So it really is the idea that somebody is paying for all of these horrible things that are happening, and that somebody is almost always Jewish power, with the Rothschilds at the very top.
And I guess the idea behind it is, well, why do they do this? Why do they fund both sides? And it's because they want more money and more power, and there's no end in sight, right? They're never satisfied. So we can never stop them, and they'll never stop on their own because they're never satisfied. Is that always the reason, or is it more complex than that?
That's the biggest reason, just the sort of pathological need to make more money. You know, a lot of it ties in with stuff that you'll find in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. You know, this idea of Jewish power taking over the world and, you know, subjugating the Christian masses and eliminating anyone who dissents and infecting us with their outsider ways. You know, there's very sort of classic in-group versus out-group stuff that goes all the way back to the very beginning of Christianity. You know, the idea that Jewish communities had their own customs and their own language, their own way of dressing. And it was always a matter of time before those things were inflicted on everybody else. And to do that required an enormous amount of money and power. And the wealthiest Jews, the over-representation of Jews in finance and in banking, that's always brought back to the Rothschilds. It gets tied into the protocols. It gets tied into, 12th century prohibitions on usury. There are hundreds and hundreds of years of this stuff that justifies the abuses that we see right now.
Well, and we've got the Rothschilds and these conspiracy theories, as you are clearly laying out. It's never going to go away. But you did mention George Soros, and that is a name that's popping up more. And I don't want to say he's replaced the Rothschilds, because who replaces anyone in this world? And it always is just a growing conspiracy or layers of the same conspiracy on top of each other. But do you see any real difference between what was said about the Rothschilds, or what still is said about them, and what is becoming a familiar talking point and the scapegoating of George Soros today?
They are very similar. And in the last chapter of the book is basically how the Rothschild conspiracy theory was replicated for Soros, tracking down the exact origins of it, who started it, how it started. Soros exploded into American politics in 2004 with his donations to the John Kerry campaign. But the Lyndon LaRouche team had been going after Soros for almost a decade at that point. And all of that stuff was written off. Oh, that's just LaRouche. He's just a cultist. And, forget about that. But some of that stuff was incorporated into the conspiracy theories that started popping up on Fox News in 2004. So they are very, very similar. The biggest differences are maybe more differences between the Rothschilds and Soros themselves. The Soros really was self-made. When he emigrated first to London, then to the US, he really had nothing. He wasn't making it in London. He couldn't get hired on by a London firm. He moves to New York, and he's one of the only people who has knowledge of how to get into the kind of growing Western European recovery. So he's able to parlay that into a, ever more important series of jobs than his own fund. And of course, we know where that ends up. The Rothschilds have been passing their wealth down from generation to generation since Mayer died in 1812. So there's kind of the old money versus new money difference. I would say the biggest difference in the conspiracies isn't their content. Their content is almost the same. The difference is the speed. The Rothschild theories really took almost 30 years from the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 to this pamphlet by Satan in 1846. There were whispers, there were sort of caricatures of the Rothschilds and cartoons of the time, but not these kinds of conspiracy theories about them controlling the world, owning 90% of the world's wealth, all this stuff. That took generations to grow. And it really took almost another generation for it to find any footing in America around the time of the Civil War. With Soros, when it started in 2004, within a few years, it's everywhere. It's Glenn Beck talking about it every night. It's Bill O'Reilly talking about it every night. It's, best-selling books written attacking him. And even just a couple of years earlier, he had no real footprint outside of the financial press. So the biggest difference isn't the content, it's just how quickly all of it happened.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember even a few years ago, Kevin McCarthy tweeted something out about George Soros and how much he was funding the Democrats, and he got criticized as, hey, this is anti-Semitic and don't do this, and he deleted the tweet. And now it's a very common, familiar talking point. You see it everywhere on social media about the Soros-funded prosecutors. It's become a meme. It's become a talking point on any right-wing show at the moment is, oh, I don't like that person because they're Soros-funded. So yeah, it is, I guess, probably gone up and down in its popularity, but until recently it was kind of a little taboo, and they managed to mainstream it and say, oh, no, it's not anti-Semitic. It's just a criticism of the left. And of course we know it's anti-Semitic, but I think nobody wants that label. Just like I think we're seeing now, and I know you've talked about this some, that a lot of people don't want the QAnon label either because it has become very toxic. So I did want to ask you, what is QAnon in 2023? Is it really something that a lot of people are still overtly joining and saying I'm a part of this, or is it something they're more likely to dog whistle to?
Sure, it's a great question. I just want to go back to Soros just for one more thing that I think is really indicative of where we are in this moment. I think it does extend to QAnon. With a lot of that Soros stuff early on, even the sort of the 2010s, Glenn Beck and his chalkboard and his puppets and all this stuff. When he was accused of anti-Semitism, he would say, "Oh no, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just criticizing George Soros for trying to take over America. This isn't about Jews. Why is George Soros being Jewish? He's not better than anybody else. Or Jews above criticism?" And you find that a lot in Rothschild criticism and conspiracy theories. I mean, really, even into the 90s with something like Pat Robertson's book, The New World Order, he was revealed as having sourced a lot of that from books of the 1920s that had in turn basically adapted it from the protocols. And when he was called out on it, he was like, no, I love the Jews. Israel has no greater friend than me. I'm only talking about the European bankers who want to take over everything. And these people are not above criticism. You had this actually very earnest debate going on in conservative media and Jewish journals of, is Pat Robertson anti-Semitic or not? We don't really have that as much anymore. It's now much more acceptable for somebody like Nick Fuentes to go on Alex Jones's show and go, yeah, we got to get rid of all the Jews. It's all of them. They're a plague. They all have to go. And everybody goes, and that has become much more acceptable. And I think with something like Q, you're seeing the same kind of mainstreaming. You're not going to get the mainstreaming of the Q drops and the sort of the numerology and the JFK Jr. stuff and the Q clock, and nobody wants to be associated with that. But the idea that, oh, sure, there's a deep state. Sure, they control everything. Sure, they rigged the election. Of course, the vaccine is poison. How could you not believe that? That to me has become very similar to the mainstreaming of, yes, we are talking about all Jews. The acceptability of conspiracy theories goes hand in hand with the sanding off of their weirder elements, because the weirder elements are not acceptable to a lot of people. But the idea that there's an all-powerful cabal that, defrauded Biden into office and is killing us with vaccines, that's really the essence of what QAnon is now. And it has nothing to do with what Q was, because Q as it was really can't exist anymore, because it really depended on Donald Trump enacting the mass arrests. And well, Donald Trump doesn't really have the power to enact much anymore, except, drooling morons at MAGA rallies.
So do you get the sense at this point, with that in mind, that conspiracy theories have sort of replaced religion for a lot of people?
I think they have in a lot of ways. We saw the rise of QAnon pastors, and a lot of churches were very concerned about the spread of conspiracy theories. You're seeing a lot of what used to be very far-right evangelical tropes, a lot of this culture war stuff is now becoming much more mainstream. It's completely wrapped up with conspiracy theories. It's usually wrapped up with anti-Semitism. Now, of course, it's usually wrapped up with transphobia. You're seeing the kind of faith that a conspiracy theory movement requires is almost supplanting religion for a lot of people, because people weren't able to go to church for a while. They weren't able to gather in those communities for a while. So they made their own communities online. And then it's like, well, I don't want to go back. I don't want to go back to my squishy church talking about social justice and trans rights. I want to go where the war is. I want to get in the gap, and I want to put on my armor of God. And so much of that stuff is completely wrapped up in conspiracy theories. And for a lot of Christian nationalists, they have been for a long time. I read a lot of Christian nationalist newsletters for the book. You're constantly talking about the, Jewish Mongol plague taking over America, and only good Christians tucked with their copy of the Bible in one hand and their copy of the protocols in the other hand, with their guns strapped to their backs. But that was much more fringy. Even the biggest of those newsletters didn't have the kind of reach that a lot of mainstream conservative podcasts and TV shows do now.
It's interesting that you bring up the Christian nationalism and QAnon, because as I was thinking about this and how I would ask you about it, it's weird because people see it as two things that often overlap, but then you start to think about it and you think, well, what's really Christian about all of this? And as you're describing what was in those newsletters, I think, I guess there are probably some Christians in history that said some of these things or even gave sermons to this effect if they were some extreme sect. But it's a whole new idea, and it doesn't feel like Christian nationalism and QAnon are two separate things. It feels more like they're kind of the same, only not everyone gets it yet. Am I right with that?
Oh, I think they're very much the same. I think they rely on the core idea that there is a holy war going on, and there is the good side and there is the evil side. And the evil side, the individual aims of the evil side will change throughout the years. For in the Cold War, it was, well, they want to Sovietize America. They've got their Moscow infiltrators everywhere, and they're going to infect us with the plague of Judeo-Bolshevism. That was very popular during the Cold War. And now it's transgender rights. And now it's, well, they want to take your gas stove away, and they want to make sure you can never have meat. And it's not even like the gun grabbing stuff. It's dumber than that, but it hits you in a place of manufactured outrage where it's like, no, you're not going to take my gas stove away. The left is never going to make me eat bugs. I'd rather die. I'd rather die than see transgender women competing in men's sports. I mean, it's just the dumbest stuff, but it's very, very easy to get people really, really angry about it. And that is completely tied in with QAnon. That is completely tied in with classic conspiracy theories. It is all iterations of the same idea that there is a holy war going on, and at some point you are going to need to decide, are you on the good side or are you on the evil side?
Yeah. No, and then you start to look at what 2024 is going to look like, and we know which side a lot of these people are going to line up on. And I guess my question with that for you would be, is the concern that we're going to see something new, that QAnon will still exist? We know these things don't go away, but you think there could be a new movement? Do you think QAnon will evolve? Do you think this is just going to be out there regardless? How worried are you about another 2024, new elections, all this money going in, everybody's riled up, everyone feels this impetus to do something? How real is the threat of violence, and how concerned should we be?
It's hugely real, and I think we definitely need to be concerned. We are seeing in this country as we speak, there does seem to be, to use the cliche, something in the water right now of an acceptability of killing right now, and it's not everywhere, and it's certainly not everybody, but we are becoming seemingly more comfortable with this idea that freedom means occasionally there's going to be a mass shooting and there's nothing we can do about it. Freedom means that you can kill somebody because they knocked on your door at night and you were afraid. Freedom means you can kill somebody because they looked at you funny and, well, maybe they were going to do something to you. That is incredibly toxic and incredibly dangerous. And when you mix it in with the constant pounding of right-wing rhetoric and fear-mongering and conspiracy theories, and then you throw Donald Trump into all of that with his, ready-made army of believers who will go to the ends of the earth for this guy. Trump has to do a few things right now to kind of shore up his far right. And I think a lot of that has to do with the COVID vaccine. But I think he will do that. And I think once he really nails down his status as the front runner for the nomination, I think we're going to be in some really dangerous waters, because here's a guy who really seems to have no trouble with throwing out red meat to get people really unhinged and commit violent acts. And we are seeing more and more that there just seems to be a veneer of if you need to kill somebody because you think they might be doing something to you, then you go ahead and do that. And Donald Trump's going to have your back if you need to do that. And that is a recipe for a lot of bad stuff happening.
So do you get a sense of how the QAnon community feels about Ron DeSantis or any other challenger to Trump, or is it Trump or nobody for those people?
I think for most of them, it's Trump or nobody. They liked DeSantis, but he doesn't have the juice. He doesn't have that thing that Trump has. He's too much of a politician. He's just a little too weird, and not the kind of weird that these people like. The biggest thing that Trump really needs to do is find a way to get the anti-vaxxers back on board, because the people who really truly believe that the vaccine is this, genocide shot are going to have a real problem with Trump's advocacy for it. So he's got to find some way to split that baby of being pro-vax and also anti-vax. And of course, once he does that, they'll go with it, because that's what they do. They'll justify anything to get what they want, and Trump is the guy who can give them what they want. So I think that once he really figures out how to get the hardcore anti-vaxxers back on board, I think he's going to be fine. And I think that they're going to all fall in line behind him. And I think we're going to have a complete rerun of 2020 with, these two old men kind of just sniping at each other. The same thing that we had in 2020. And I don't know when America is going to cast off this idea that everybody who, has power in this country has to be 1 million years old. But I think we still have at least one more election cycle of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were talking about how one of the things that's kind of really terrifying you the most, and I would definitely agree with you on this one, is that we've normalized killing to a large extent in this culture. We've spent the last few years sort of making it more okay to say, oh, well, this person did this or this person did that, and that's why they ended up getting killed. The other thing I've noticed that we've sort of normalized is the idea that we're going to show graphic footage or share graphic footage of these things under the guise of people need to know about this, which seems like, at least to me, a really terrible idea, because if this was something that was going to actually work, it would have worked, 10, 12, 15, 20 mass shootings ago when these pictures came out. It would have worked after Columbine. It would have worked after Newtown, Connecticut. It didn't work after any of these things. So what are people trying to accomplish, do you think, by putting out this call for quote unquote awareness of these things as an excuse to post what are usually pretty much gore videos at this point?
Yeah, I completely agree with you that it is not helpful at all to unwittingly shove these videos and pictures into people's social media feeds. And I think it's actually quite traumatic. These are basically snuff films. Yeah. And if it's not your job, if you're not completely prepared to see something like this, it is extremely traumatic to see stuff like that. I mean, that can stay with people for the rest of their lives. That's the first thing. The second is that the victims of these crimes didn't give their consent to have their pictures splashed out like that. And a lot of these people are children. And their parents didn't give that kind of consent. People just decide, maybe for noble reasons, to say, well, we need people to understand how bad this is. If you need a picture of a dead child to know that a mass shooting is bad, you probably aren't going to be swayed by a picture of a dead child. The people who need to be swayed are the people enthralled to the NRA, are the American politicians who torpedo every single gun control measure, the right-wing influencers who will troll the victims of these crimes. They don't care. Their personal freedom, their ability to collect 500 guns and wear them around when they go to get coffee, that means more to them than any victim ever will. Once we decided as a society that the Sandy Hook massacre was something that only required maybe some executive order by a namby-pamby Obama who was crying over these dead kids, that was it. No picture is going to change these people. You think a picture of a dead kid is going to suddenly make Ted Cruz go, yeah, we really do need to ban AR-15s. It's not going to happen. They don't care. Yeah. So you're traumatizing people in the service of something that is not going to matter anyway. And I just have a huge problem with it.
Yeah, it seemed like it was an absolutely raging debate over this past weekend with the shooting in Allen, Texas, of whether people should do this or not. And the amount of people that seem to think it's going to raise awareness to the point where something positive will happen, I'll never understand at this point.
No, it's not. And you see a lot of bad comparisons of it. Like, the showing pictures from the Vietnam War, catalyzed opposition to the Vietnam War. There was already opposition to the Vietnam War. And the public, by and large, is already against it. What you're doing is you are showing people who did not give permission their, corpses to people who don't necessarily want to see them. And I just don't find I just don't find anything acceptable about that.
Well, and you've got people now, social media companies have never done a great job of policing, well, anything. Yeah. But you've got people now on Twitter that are posting this as research or citizen journalism or reporting, whatever they're calling it. But they also know that they're not going to get banned for this. And maybe a year ago they would have, and now they're not. And I know you don't look exactly at the statistics of this, of how much something like Twitter has changed since it got new ownership, but it sure doesn't feel like it's helping, does it? It doesn't seem like it's gotten better under the current leadership there, has it?
Oh no, it's so much worse. And that you can't statistically quantify whether your own experience on something is better or worse, but I know my experience on Twitter is markedly worse. It is. I mean, putting aside all the technical problems, now you don't know who anybody is. You don't know whether somebody is who they claim to be because there's no verification. And the only people who have verification are by and large people who bought it. And then you look at the replies of somebody who you do know and trust, and like the replies are all Musk super fans. And it's like, these people are not worth interacting with. They have nothing interesting to say. They have nothing helpful to say. So the experience of Twitter has gotten measurably worse. It's not much fun anymore. I don't care about something getting viral or getting new followers. I'm like, it's just a mess. And once there's a real viable alternative, I think people really will leave it. And we just don't have that mass market viable alternative yet.
Yeah, I thought the Breitbart 2016 comment section was bad, but now it's just on Twitter and it's just the replies to everything. And you're right. It's still useful for promotions. You want people to get your content, know who you are, get the word out. But yeah, increasingly, I'm just not spending time there because what's the point? This place is probably kind of slowly dying anyway, and there's no real alternative. And I mean, I hope that there is, but yeah, now that people don't feel like there's any threat of losing their account, they're letting their hair down, and it's gruesome and it's gross. And we've seen it with, the shooting in Texas with Jordan Neely and that whole situation and New York. And, I mean, it's really, there's a lot of things that are disheartening out there. And I know that it's tough to see all this. And if you try to put it in perspective and say, oh, the statistics and the real threat to me is not that high. But I think people do get overwhelmed by this. So I did want to ask you because I think there may be some people out there who just need to hear this, but have you personally seen people come back from the brink, from the being enthralled by conspiracy theories or sort of this vile, hateful rhetoric? Is there a way back for the friends, family members, people you love?
I have seen people come back from it. There is a way back. It is very difficult. And what makes it really difficult is that there's no established framework for it. There isn't AA for conspiracy theories. We're all kind of making this up as we go along. And particularly when it comes to any kind of mental health aspect of conspiracy theories, I think immediately as soon as you start talking about that, people are like, oh, you're saying that, mental illness, all people with mental illness are conspiracy theories. Of course, I'm not saying that, but there is an overlap. And the way to get out of it, unfortunately, is different for every single person, because every single person's journey into conspiracy theories and extremism is different. Every person's radicalization is a little bit different. It's, has a different inciting incident. It's pushed along by different things. So every single person has a different way out. And unfortunately, you can't get out of it unless you want to. Unless you see the problems and you see the toxicity and you see the addiction to social media and the easy use of violent ideation, unless you start to see that as a problem, then you don't have any reason to leave it behind. You think everybody else has the problem. You think everybody else is the one who needs to be, awake and turned on to the real problems. So unless you really yourself come to the realization that, hey, something is wrong here and I'm being lied to and exploited, Then if there are sympathetic people in your life, they can help you start to get out of it. But for most people, they're so far gone that everybody cuts them out. Everybody who might want to help them just says, I don't want anything to do with you anymore. You're crazy. You're violent. Go away. And that is a very natural reaction to a lot of this stuff because it's extremely unpleasant. And the people who believe it are not shy about sharing it with you. And the easiest thing to do can be to just block that person and cut them out of your life. And then the only people they have left are their conspiracy community. And those people aren't going to let you go. You're one of them now. And they're the people who listen to you and they don't think you're crazy. They believe the same thing you do. So it really does take a person realizing that there's a problem and then having people in their life who can help them define the problem and come up with solutions to the problem. And that is a very tricky combination.
So if you're one of those family members of the person who's bought into QAnon, do you have any recommendations where you think people should go for advice and support if they find themselves in that situation, trying to talk down a relative or a friend who might have just gone off the deep end on this one?
It's a good question. There are unfortunately just not that many resources. The one that comes up a lot is something like the QAnon casualties subreddit, which I think is a really, really important place. I would say that for dealing with somebody in your life who really has gone down the rabbit hole, what you almost want to do is just try to connect them back to real life. Hey, I know, we used to talk about baseball a lot. Hey, did you catch the game the other day? Hey, did you see the new Guardians of the Galaxy movie? Did you do this thing that people in normal life do? If you live close to them, hey, you want to go for a hike with me? They're probably going to say no. They're probably going to call it part of the deep state or say that you're in on the plot or whatever it is. But you're trying to connect them with the normal world, with the healthy world, with the world where you can enjoy things and do things that are not evil or satanic or connected to pedophiles. And if you keep trying to engage in those very basic kinds of ways, you can present yourself as kind of a safe harbor of somebody who is not going to mock you for having these beliefs that everybody else are going to think is stupid and dangerous. If you have that one person in your life who is just that strand back to the world that the rest of us live in, you can help somebody out of it. And you don't even necessarily need to know anything about the conspiracies. It's probably better if you don't, right? Because the temptation is always going to be to try to debate them, to debunk it, send them articles. That stuff is just not going to work. It's going to work for you to help you understand what they're going through, but it's not going to work for the person who is deep into that belief because they're just going to see it as part of the conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, that's really great advice, and we appreciate all your insight. Do you have your next book in mind? What else are you working on going forward?
I'm kicking around some ideas for another book. I'm also looking at, I'm very seriously looking at turning the Rothschilds book into a documentary series. Cool. Taking some meetings on that already, starting to develop that as a pitch, doing some other expert witness work and things like that. I might do another book down the line, but I want to get this one out there first and kind of see how that develops, and then we'll go from there.
The new book is called Jewish Space Lasers. It's in pre-order now. Feel free to pick up your copy. Mike Rothschild, thank you so much for coming on with us again today. Really appreciate your time and having you here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have to do this again.
Thanks, Mike.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can go to didnothingwrongpod.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at James, the word 4 and the letter M, all one word, and Grizza BJJ, Grza BJJ, as well as DNW Pod. Thanks again for tuning in, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.